Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about 5 tips when writing fantasy novels. For those of you who follow me on my social media accounts, I think on my Facebook page I released a picture this week of a drawing that I did, a digital art drawing of one of my characters in my novel A Chronicle of Crowns. And I said that I was going to do a video dedicated for the character, and I still am, but I'm going to wait until I have a couple more of these character drawings under my belt so that I can just do the whole series. Because that one picture took me about 2 weeks to do, and granted I was learning how to use Photoshop and how to draw in Photoshop, so there was a big learning curve there, but I just thought that I would finish a few more before I started that series. So instead today I decided I was going to talk about 5 tips for writing fantasy, or really any type of novel. And these are all tips that I kind of discovered on my own and used when I was writing my book A Chronicle of Crowns. So the first tip that I have has to do with characters and settings. Before you even set out writing and creating a story, you have to make sure that your characters and your settings are well fleshed out, and this is especially important for fantasy writers. What I did was I created different character sheets with characteristics and a little bio about each character. And because I'm kind of obsessive compulsive about these things, I went a little overboard, and I kind of delved really deep into all of my different races and my different settings and all the different characters that I had, just to make sure that I had them well-rounded. I really make use of the app Evernote for things like this. I have all of my information in Evernote and I update it constantly as I'm writing. But you can also do character sheets, which is something that I've done as well. And what you do is basically just fill out the information for each character. I've yet to find a good app for keeping track of your characters and your settings. I've downloaded a few in the past, things like Persona, but I've never really liked their interface or really got into them. Right now I just use Evernote. I keep specific notes for each characters and settings. But what you want to do before you start writing is make sure that you understand your fantasy world intricately. You want to know how magic is used in your world if you have magic. And magic is one of those things that's very sort of unique to the worlds that you create. And you need to understand how it's used, or how your magic wielders wield their magic, because if you don't, it can really mess you up later on. And this includes other things like social structures, leaders of different cities, how characters would interact with one another, and things like that. You don't want to have this kind of vague idea of what you're writing about before you jump into it. You want everything well fleshed out so that the writing process is as easy and painless as possible. It's not as important when writing generic fiction, I think. I think it's more important when writing fantasy, because as the writer you're sort of creating this world for yourself and you want it to be believable for your readers. If you're worried about this aspect, then I would suggest writing fan fiction first, where you have a world that's already established and some characters that are already established. And I know a lot of fantasy writers go this route. They write fan fiction while they're writing their novels, and I think it really helps with kind of figuring out where you want to go with your novel and your characters and getting into a world that isn't our own. This next little tip has to do with inspiration and where you find it. Don't be afraid to mold ideas from existing material. A lot of fantasy writers are sort of inspired by each other and the genre that they're writing in, and a lot of fantasy is kind of similar. I know for some people writing fantasy can be kind of daunting because you don't really know where to begin, and you think that all of the ideas that you're having swimming around in your head are ideas that you've just taken from a bunch of different materials and kind of mashed into your own thing. But that's what writers sort of do. Even writers like George R.R. Martin, his whole series is based off of a historical event called the War of the Roses, which was in England. He basically took that event and warped it and put it in a fantasy world and came up with the Game of Thrones. J.R.R. Tolkien, he used a lot of Norse mythology as sort of an inspiration for the background of his world in Middle-earth. And in particular, the Ents came from the Shakespeare play Macbeth. In Macbeth, there's kind of this warning of his imminent doom that talks about when Burnham Woods marches to Dunsinane, which is the keep that Macbeth is in. And Tolkien was always very kind of let down by how this played out. It wasn't really the wood that marched there, it was an army that used the woods as a disguise to kind of creep up on the keep, and Tolkien used this kind of idea by creating the Ents and having them march to Isengard to destroy the keep there. Terry Brooks, who is a more kind of modern fantasy writer, he wrote the Shannara Chronicles in the 70s. He was greatly influenced by Tolkien, and some say he might have ripped off Tolkien like blatantly, but his books still made a lot of money and made a huge impact on fantasy and the fantasy genre. J.K. Rowling was also influenced by a lot of different books and stories that are pre-existing. Books like the Iliad, the Chronicles of Narnia, and the Jane Austen novel Emma. She was really influenced by a number of different books and novels to create different characters and different scenes. There's a scene in the Goblet of Fire, I think it is, where Cedric Diggory has died, and the whole scene kind of plays out like a scene in the Iliad, and she mentioned that that's where she got the inspiration to do that scene. So don't be afraid to take from pre-existing works and mold it into what you need to get your story across. Also, don't be afraid to use stereotypical archetypes to create your character. In my book, I have a character named Howell Pendengale, who is essentially the old wizard archetype that you see all throughout fantasy. With characters like Dumbledore, Gandalf, Alanon, Merlin, Aslan, you know, they all kind of are the same archetype, but each writer brings something new to the table and molds them the way that best fits their story. So if you think your work sounds too familiar or a character sounds like something that you've already seen before, don't worry about it, because as you write, these characters will develop on their own, and by the end they may have similar aspects to previous characters, but they'll be their own complete character. Unless you're Tolkien, who's kind of the grandfather of fantasy, you shouldn't really have a plot-driven story anymore. Plot-driven stories are great, and obviously you need plot to kind of tell your story, but nowadays character-driven stories are a lot more compelling than plot-driven stories. In plot-driven stories, you kind of have this timeline that goes on and you plop in characters as you kind of go. And sometimes this works. I mean, with Tolkien's work, he had very unique characters that we got to see develop as they carried on throughout this plot. But with amateur writers, it seems like the plot is a lot more heavy and the characters almost take a back seat to the driving plot. The best way to work around this is to do character-driven storylines. And if you've created characters that are human enough, you'll have an audience that kind of follows along with them and sympathizes with them. What plot-driven novels tend to do is flatten your characters. And this isn't always the case. I'm just saying generally, and especially with fantasy. Because with fantasy you have these grand overarching plots, you want to see them from a character's eyes. You want to see how these experiences change the characters and how they are coping with the different tasks that are ahead of them. I like to see how the little plot points develop the characters and change them from how they were at the beginning to how they end up at the end of the book. Whatever your genre is, whatever the genre is that you're writing in, make sure you read examples of that. I used to be someone who would read maybe like 5 books tops in a year. I just wasn't really interested in reading, I was more interested in writing. But reading is really good for influencing your own creativity and your own writing style. By reading more often, your grammar gets a lot better and your word choice changes too. It helps you to sort of understand how to tackle plot problems and character problems a lot easier, and makes writing a lot more smooth. Other works can really influence your own writing style or a specific scene. I read the book Let Me In by John Ajay Lindqvist because I was writing a series of chapters at the time that had a kind of horror, sinister element to it, and I didn't know how to tackle that. And reading the way that he created suspense and created terror really influenced the way that I went about creating the same emotions in my chapters. Not only is reading fun and can help broaden your imagination, it can help in your writing a lot. So my last tip, and probably the most important tip on this list, is to just write. A lot of beginning writers, and I was definitely guilty of this, they kind of get stuck in this loop of writing and revision. And by writing and revision, I don't mean writing an entire book and going back and revising it. I mean writing a chapter, then going back to read it over and fixing it up, then reading it over again, fixing it up some more, and it kind of creates this loop that you can get stuck in where you just kind of end up with 1 or 2 chapters that you are constantly revising over and over again. And for someone like me who has obsessive compulsive tendencies, it can be really difficult to break, but it's the best thing you can do for your writing. Basically, you just write your first chapter and you don't look back, and then you finish the entire book, and then you go back and you revise and you edit. If you make changes to characters or settings later on in the book, then make sure to note them down somewhere in Evernote or something like that, so that you can go back and easily fix the mistakes in prior chapters. Editing is for the editing stage only, and I know it's really hard to break, but you just have to write all the way through and finish the book. Once you finish the whole book, it's such a sweeter experience than finishing a couple chapters. So that's about it for this video. If you liked these tips and if you thought they were helpful, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There will be a lot more videos like this, and I'll be getting more into my novel series as I go on. I'll also have a few photography videos coming up. I was really excited when spring started because then I could get out and start shooting again because I hate winter. But then winter came back, so that was fun. As always, you can check out my social media links below. Make sure you head over to Amazon. My books are out there. Both of my free preludes are out for book 1 and book 2, and book 1 and book 2 of A Chronicle of Crowns are out, and you can purchase them on Amazon.com. Also, make sure to head over to Lulu.com and get your hands on Transcendence, which was my first photography and poetry series. And yeah, that's about it. See y'all next week. I probably shouldn't be drinking and filming at the same time.